Are we live? All right. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs. My name is Halvard Leira. I'm one of two research directors here. I will moderate today's proceedings. Welcome also to those following the live stream and those who discover this video later. Our topic today balances challenges and opportunities. In a world where conflict is on the rise and many international institutions seem paralyzed, is international cooperation still possible? And if so, what forms can it take? Which players will be central? Which policy areas hold the most potential? And what can the global institutional architecture look like? To discuss this, we first have a keynote given by Iver B. Neumann, who is the director at the Fridtjof Nansen's Institute, former director of Nobel, former Montague Burton Professor of IR at the LSE, former research professor and research director here at NUPI, author and editor of tens of books and hundreds of articles. That will be followed by discussion, including Iver and two other prominent scholars, Katharina Glaab, who's sitting here, associate professor at the Norwegian University of Life Sciences, Marianne Riddervold, research professor at ARENA in Oslo, and also here at NUPI. This seminar is a product of two different projects. One based at NUPI, financed by the Research Council of Norway, called Earth to Orbit, Building Bridges in Space. For some reason, that has the acronym DISCOVER.
Sounds cool, though.
It sounds really good. This is a recently started project focusing on international cooperation in space governance. It includes Marianne, and it also includes Mai'a K, sitting in front here, who's Dean's Professor of Political Science, International Affairs and Diplomacy, and Director of the Center for International Affairs and World Cultures at Northeastern University in Boston. And the second project that are funding this seminar is a Carnegie-funded project led by Mai'a. So she will kick us off by presenting that project. Then we will have our keynotes. Then there's the discussion up here, which I will moderate, and then an open Q&A with you, the audience. So without further ado, Mai'a.
Thank you. Good morning. Thank you so much for joining us here at NUPI for what I think will be a very provocative and timely discussion. And so, as Halvard mentioned, before we hear from Iver Neumann on the question, is international cooperation still possible? I think this is increasingly an urgent question. I want to briefly frame the research project that has brought many of us here today from actually around the world, really to look at, with a fresh look, how have we possibly overlooked policies that might actually help spur cooperation. So as mentioned, the Carnegie Corporation of New York is funding our investigation into transnational political networks and their role in shaping global order. And the overarching question that's driving our work is, how do we explain breakthroughs in international cooperation during periods that seem defined by great power competition, geopolitical tension, fragmentation? And I know many of you actually work in policy environments where the conventional wisdom is pretty bleak right now. The liberal international order is under great strain. Multilateral institutions appear gridlocked. We're seeing the return of so-called spheres of influence, economic decoupling. Some are calling this a new Cold War. If you're a policymaker and you're trying to advance cooperation on climate, on arms control, global health, any number of these transboundary challenges, it can feel like pushing a boulder up a hill. And yet, I think this is really crucial. Cooperation continues to happen across the globe, sometimes in unexpected ways. The 2024 UN High Seas Treaty is an example. Growing international consensus on AI governance frameworks, unprecedented coordination in response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, despite the fact that many predicted Western fragmentation. Indigenous movements successfully embedding their paradigms and new paradigms into UN Sustainable Development frameworks. These are not marginal achievements. These represent significant shifts in global norms, policies, and practices. So the question is, how do we explain this? And the dominant approaches to understanding international relations, realism focusing on power distributions, even some liberal institutionalist arguments, they tend to treat transnational networks, which is the focus of our research, as sort of secondary actors at best. There's just this heavy emphasis on material capabilities, great power bargaining, and this is assumed to drive outcomes. So what our research is demonstrating is that standard approaches miss a crucial mechanism of change, the social power of transnational political networks. These are groups of individuals, experts, activists, practitioners. They transcend national borders. They collectively champion transformational ideas. And I think when we hear from Iver today, he'll really emphasize that this has actually, it's not a new phenomenon. It has been historically present that you get these breakthroughs in cooperation. It's the capacity to persuade. It's about being able to reshape how problems are understood, to build coalitions around ideas that really resonate with more inclusive and fundamental human values. So in particular, we're looking at groups and individuals who take on an ultra-social worldview, this inclusivity rather than exclusive orientation, an orientation towards the common good rather than narrow self-interest. Networks like these operate at a truly regional or global scale, and they have been shown to actually make breakthroughs in cooperation. We're finding across a dozen case studies or more that when you combine these characteristics of this kind of inclusive outlook, transformational, inspiring ideas, and good sort of pathways to success in policy, even if there are structural constraints, you can have success. Success isn't automatic, but we're looking at how this can be achieved. So looking at the High Seas Treaty example, the combination of scientific expertise with grassroots mobilization and strategic diplomacy was key. By contrast, something like antimicrobial resistance governance, this has actually been fragmented in the approach to try to make a breakthrough, and they've had difficulty building a broader coalition. So you have the same type of a global common problem that people share, but very different outcomes, and we want to understand why. And I think, the case on AI governance, which is really on the top of mind for many policymakers, it's important to notice, and our research shows that framing emerging technologies through human security lenses rather than narrow kind of technical or economic frameworks really matters. So I think this is important not only for scholars like ourselves, but for policy communities. When do these efforts at cooperation succeed and when do they fall short? Are networks possible in this process to actually catalyze change, especially if they bridge elite expertise and societal mobilization? The framing of ideas actually matters, whether it appeals to our sense of common morality and inclusivity, environmental stewardship. Timing matters. It's not deterministic, but timing can also play a role. Crises create openings. Sometimes networks step in and they actually take advantage of crises. Sometimes they fail. They don't seize the opportunity. So why we think this really matters for policymakers is that if we just assume and accept that great power competition makes multilateralism and cooperation unworkable, then we'll be blind to the actual mechanisms and strategies that actually make cooperation happen. So we'll end up underinvesting in certain strategies. We'll fail to recognize opportunities when they emerge. And so it's really important that we have these practical implications for breakthroughs in international cooperation. We have to look for example, allies and leverage points when formal diplomatic channels are blocked. How can we frame transformational ideas to build broader coalitions? how do you get momentum when there's a stall in international negotiations? So Iver will address this question from a somewhat broader, different perspective, which will probably bring more of the state interests part of the puzzle into mind, and I think that's very important as well. But I think as we get to the discussion and so forth, networks as the way to capture and organize civil society across borders becomes an important part of the puzzle. And being able to recognize that then allows us to sort of reveal and spotlight processes that have been overlooked. So it's not just intellectually interesting, it's actually strategically essential. And that's why I'm very much interested in today's discussion, and I'm happy to now turn it over to Iver, who will paint the bigger historical picture for us today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mai'a. These are grim times, and I salute you for asking a question like, is international cooperation still possible? It is a burning question. It is also somehow right. How do you address a question like that? The easy way out is to simply say yes and walk away from it. That would be too simple. So I thought I would actually go down to the bare bones and start by looking at the competition, other species. If we look at our closest known relative, the Neanderthals, they were not able to sit together and eat. When we find places where they've been living, we can find different little fires, one family around each fire. So they were living like Maggie Thatcher said we should live. There is no such thing as society, only individuals and their families, each with their little firewood and their little fire. If we turn to other species like bees and ants, we find a lot of cooperation. The ant heap and the beehive are cooperative places. However, biologists remind us that human cities are actually much more advanced when it comes to cooperation. We cooperate much better than the beehive does. The problem is that there is also a hell of a lot of conflict. So the question, is international cooperation still possible, is in this sense superfluous because humans are a cooperating species, right? And this gives me hope, you know. When cooperation fails, which does all the time, we can remind ourselves that we are a cooperating species. The only problem is that we're also a tussling species. So the question is, where are the balances between this? And another story, sort of springing from this, that gives hope, I think, is to chart how humans have actually learned to cooperate on a group level. Not on an individual level, on a group level. And we know quite a lot about that because archaeologists have spent some time trying to dig up evidence of how this actually happened. And what we find is that with sedentariness, when people actually settled down, you would have what archaeologists call peer group. You would have a group that looks very much like the group next door. There is isomorphism, as you would say. And cooperation between these peer groups will always be there, and it will always be accompanied by conflict, of course, because they will try to draw one of them. The cooperation as such is actually what forwards their case, you know. We find this throughout the world in the Neolithic, in the Younger Stone Age. And as we sort of come to the Bronze Age, we see that the emergence of more advanced technologies make it possible to not only to exchange metals, of course, although that is an important thing, but we see other institutions that we recognize as international relations scholars popping up. For example, law and diplomacy. And I think we spend too little time in our studies mulling over what happened in early written history. if we look at somewhere like Mesopotamia, where you have a city-state system already from the sort of early age of 3,500, 3,400 before our era, we have a lot of written material documenting cooperation between these city-states. Not just trade, but also diplomacy, and we have rudiments of them later, but they're there. And these stories are continuous stories. Even when we have something like the Bronze Age collapse around 1200, we see that the basic ways of cooperation pop up again. So you might then say, but these are rudimentary things. These are not really doesn't sort of account for much. Well, I would argue that you would be wrong. We make a basic mistake in the Western tradition of sort of talking about the Greeks as the beginning of everything. Well, Egyptians at the stretch. It is true that the Greek breakthrough in terms of logos is enormous. And I'm a big fan of Western Civ. That's not the issue here. The issue is that in terms of city-states and in terms of levels of corporations of city-states, you find the same level of cooperation in Mesopotamia as you find in ancient Greek. So you find the same thing, more or less, mutatis mutandi, in the 4th millennium before our era, and definitely in the 3rd, as you find amongst the Greek ancient city-states in the 5th century before our era. And this, I think, gives us hope. We have a continuous historical story of cooperation at a fairly advanced level between fairly advanced political entities. You may then say that this is not all that relevant because all these entities cooperating would be culturally homogeneous, and it would always be simpler to cooperate with culturally homogeneous entities because you know how they would think. You somehow know what to expect. But this is not the case that we only have this kind of material. We have a number of documents that actually show intense cooperation between 3 very different civilizations already in the 1700s, 1600s, 1500s before our era, where Hittites, Egyptians, and Mesopotamians, Babylonians if you like, are cooperating and are actually forming very solid patterns of cooperation. Again, not only in trade, but also when it comes to law and diplomacy. So I think that the sort of the prehistoric and early historic record demonstrates that international cooperation is not only possible, but it has matured in a degree that, again, gives us hope. We like hope, don't we like hope? Yeah. We like hope, yeah. And I think if we then turn to what I suppose you would have expected me to talk about, the world since the 1500s, it's the same story. Again, we find cooperation against all odds, to riff off the title of Mai'a's latest book. I think a key work here is 2 articles by Jack Levi and Catherine Barbieri on trade during wartime, where they're able to demonstrate, to me very convincingly indeed, that during wartime you still find trade going on. And this, it comes as no surprise as where that Norway is trading vigorously in aluminium, or aluminum as you would say, with the Russians as we speak. We're supposed to have this boycott. Well, yes, but we have a brisk trade in aluminium. If you look at Spain, I'm sure that they have a brisk trade in apples with whatever they specialize in. No, that would be Poland. I mean, if you start looking, I mean, there are all these, on the newspaper level, you have to, oh my God, you know, they're still trading with Russia. And I happen to be amongst those who think that we shouldn't trade that much with Russia, but that's beside the point. The historical record is pretty unequivocal here. that trade will be going on during wartime as well. You trade with the enemy. And this goes for other institutions as well. Again, diplomacy. We're always talking about cutting off diplomatic relations in wartime, and we do. No doubt about that. We make a big spiel out of cutting relations, and there are standing operational procedures, standard practices for how you discontinue diplomacy in wartime. Except there are always back channels. Always. Usually they come to light years later, but they are there. So I'm pretty confident, on one level, when it comes to the present situation with Russia, everyone that I meet working in different foreign ministries around the world talk about how few contacts they have with the Russians. And this is true. In this country, we have a bilateral trade, bilateral fisheries agreement. Rather, we have two, one from 1974, one from 1975. And these have taken on a rather important hue because it's one of the few places where a Western country actually still has institutionalized regular cooperation with Russia. And we think, maybe there can be no other, maybe there are no other contacts. Well, I'm not on your nilly, as the Brits say. I mean, the contacts are going on. There are back channels, because there always are. So diplomacy is not the opposite of war. Diplomacy happens parallel to war. It only takes on a more informal aspect. Law, we're always complaining about jus in bello, laws for how to regulate warfare, are not followed. But most of the states follow most of the rules most of the time. The reason why we are talking about atrocities at all is that they stand out from a series of actually regulated stuff. So again, the answer to the question, is international cooperation still possible, is a resounding yes. So I think in light of this, we should specify the question, change it from a digital one, yes or no, to an analog one, and specify it in time and ask, will the balance between cooperation and conflict that we saw throughout the international system during the configuration of international order that we now know as the liberal world order be sustained, or will it taper off? I mean, that was a rather circuitous way of coming to that pretty simple specification, but I enjoyed it. Hope you did. The basic question then would be, what about sovereignty? And again, we see that there are certain signs that sovereignty is being flaunted. States do not necessarily respect other states' right to exist at all. And if we think with Alexander Wendt and Chris Roy-Smith, this is the key thing. We see US wanting Greenland, Panama, Canada. We see China wanting Taiwan. We see Russia wanting Ukraine, etc. And all this is local bad news, but does it really threaten the principle of sovereignty? No, it does not. If the EU became a state tomorrow, would that threaten the principle of sovereignty? Of course not. It would remain the principle of the international system. And that would go for the otherwise extremely unfortunate examples that I gave as well, but it would not threaten the principle of sovereignty. It's not on that level, I think, that we should look at the changes. It's more specifically the three legs of the liberal world order that should be scrutinized. Democracy and rule of law, that would be one. Free trade, international organization. There is no doubt that democracy is under attack. I mean, we have Alex Cooley in the audience, who's been doing work on this for years before it became the central issue for some certain other people. But again, what did we expect? I mean, when Henry Kissinger became National Security Advisor in 1969, he presented President Nixon with a book. Strange thing to do, given Tricky Dick's political record, but he did. And that book was Oswald Spengler's Untergang des Abendlandes, The Decline of the West. Now, why did he do such a thing? Because he wanted to drive home the point that the long perspective for US policymaking was that other states would come out of the woodworks, would come out and claim a larger role, or maybe even an equal role in international relations to that the US had at the time. And that this was historically inevitable. Henry K was obviously right. But as already Plato said, those who decide do not read and write, and those who read and write do not decide. So the gift of the book had little effect. And as we can see from the present US president, I don't think that argument has effect today either. But let's face it, even if we make a maximum version of the West and say that we push 1 billion people, there are still 7.2 billion people elsewhere. And how can we have a world order if those aren't somehow integrated? Will democracy suffer in the process? Well, it can hardly be a surprise that it does. I mean, if you look at Chinese history, it's not exactly a history of democracy, ladies and gentlemen. So what would we expect? Right? I mean, people are despairing, but I think this has the hue of the historically inevitable about it. What we can do is what Henry K told us to do. We can keep cool and carry on with trying to sort of salvage the remnants of what we have, to stand up for our way of life, as it were. When we look at free trade, again, there is no doubt that the hegemon has lost his nerve. The US no longer has a president that goes into the breach for free trade. On the contrary, he calls himself Mr. Tariff Man. And this is not necessarily a huge surprise. I mean, from the days of Ricardo and Heckscher Ohlin, we have known the theorem of free trade. The comparative advantage, I produce something, you produce something. If we can do it cheaper than the other party, we can swap and we can both make money. There's an inbuilt thing here, which is that sooner or later someone else will come around and take your comparative advantage. Since we're having this conversation in Norway, let's take the example of ship wharfs. Norway used to be a big shipbuilding nation. Then in the late 60s, early 70s, one discovered that ships were now being built in places like Singapore for a fraction of what we could build them for here. What happened? Well, of course, we stopped building ships. And we then used our welfare state to help out workers that were laid off. And we used our welfare state to stimulate a retooling of the production into sort of stuff supporting oil and gas industry and things like that. So we took the consequence of losing a comparative advantage and built another one. Now the problem in the US is that when these things happen, when Motown is suddenly emptied, when Detroit is suddenly emptied of car producers that go to China, there is no American welfare state there to help those who are laid off, and there is no state there to help stimulating growth in another sort of branch of the economy. So as a good self-righteous little Scandinavian, I would like to congratulate us all on having a good little mechanism there for our state building where we can actually pull through on stuff like that. The US, as we see now, does not. And there is plenty of dynamics. I mean, tech, the big tech, big tech is a huge problem. We should talk about it during the discussion. But generally, do we see an American economy that is able to respawn and come up with new stuff in order to sort of to substitute for the old comparative advantages that we don't see? Well, probably not. But I think the major thing is not cooperation on having a regime type like democracy. It's not free trade, however important that is. I think it's the question of international organizations. You talk about transnational networks, and they are hugely important. But the big brother here is the international organization. And again, in the name of history, I think it's a good idea to do a short review of where international organizations come from, with international organizations being primarily states that have organizations that have states as their member, of count states amongst their members. The first international organization in world history was formed in 1815 in order to maintain trade on the river Rhine. And the challenge was twofold. One, Rhine was silting up. And if a river silts up, then you can't navigate it. So you have to do something in order to keep it clean, as it were. And this is a very simple thing to do. You stop the ships that are coming by, you give them a rake, put that rake behind the ship will then pass, and you take the rake back and you give it to the next ship. So you silt the damn thing, right? The other challenge was that there were a number of riparian states on the Rhine, and they all wanted to tax the trade. And if you have 4, 5, 6 states taxing the same trade, then of course that trade is not sustainable. So the solution was ingenious, talking about coming up with new ways of cooperation. At the Congress of Vienna, one decided that, all right, states will go together and they put up a little secretariat and they will organize this. They will organize the rake business of silting the river, and they will organize the sort of coordination of the taxis. And an international organization was born. It's still there as a secretariat in Vienna with 6 people working on a permanent basis. Great international organization. Then there's nothing until 1956, after the Crimean War, where the same kind of organization is set up for the Danube. And then in 1865, there's an international telegraph union, this wonderful new technology of the telegraph. One needs some kind of international cooperation in order for states to use that system. Then you have the telephone, the so-called functional international organizations, and then you have the League of Nations as an overarching general thing. And you have the UN, and today the Yearbook of International Organizations lists 45,000 organizations and give details. But people talk about there being hundreds of thousands of international organizations. This is an enormous success. Why is this so important? Well, there's a very simple answer to that. If you have expectations of how you can manage crises and questions that pop up, then you have regularity, you have transparency, you have the possibility of foresight. So you have a better organized world. And the reason why we don't spend more time on all this is that we take it for granted. If a Norwegian fishing vessel in the North Atlantic gets into a tussle with the Spanish one, say, and the human species, after all, is a tussling one, so these things will happen, then in the old days, this might have caused an international incident. What happens now is that an organization called NIAF comes in, and it's an international organization where they have the setup for handling this kind of stuff. So the sting is taken out of a lot of potential conflicts all of the time on a quotidian basis. It happens literally every hour. It is a better organized world than what we had before. And it's something to celebrate. Well, it's something to celebrate for some people, not for all. On the 4th of February, President Donald Trump issued an executive order, and the title is worth quoting in full: withdrawing the United States from and ending funding to certain United Nations organizations and reviewing United Nations support to all international organizations. What's going on here? What's going on here is a concerted attack on the entire idea that international organizations will make for a better world. It's a concerted attack on the entire idea of cooperation. Right? And Trump gives 3 basic reasons for this. One is that international cooperation infringes American sovereignty. Another one is that it infringes on the US freedom of action. And the third one is that it costs. There is something very familiar about this. As a married man, I immediately recognize all 3 ideas from when I'm disgruntled and dissatisfied with the way things go. Everyone who's been trying to relate to other humans know that there is a price to pay, in the sense that you can't do what you want all the time. That you have to take into consideration what other people think, and that you, even in your basic interests, you may have to sort of adjust. And you know that it takes money to maintain cooperation. This is a serious challenge, I think, to one of the basic ideas of the species, that cooperation is something that brings a lot of advantages. To highlight the cost of cooperation instead of the gain is, a Brit would say, interesting. And I think we are at the sort of core of the question here, of what the question of is international cooperation still possible means. It's about the ecology of international organizations and, with respect for the project, transnational networks. I think this adds up to an entire social order. And with a social order, I mean configurations of practices that organize social life, as Emanuel Adler would put it. And one of those social orders is the world order. So, where does that land us? I think what we have here is a very simple thing. It's Donald Trump is launching an attack on the ecology of international organizations in the name of great power concert. The idea that when problems emerge, they should be tackled not by international organizations, not by all states, but by a few great powers working in concert. I mean, the word concert may make you think of music, and rightly so, but concerto simply means, in Italian, simply means also that you cooperate in concert, as the English say. So this is where we are. Where does all this land us in relation to ongoing stuff? Well, I think we can find this onslaught of the idea of an ecology of international organizations high and low in international relations these days. And to start with a grand example, and I think it's important to give a grand example because the business of international organizations is quotidian. That's the entire point. The entire point of international organizations is to take grand, big conflicts and make them into tiny, sort of stuff that can be regulated. Right? That's the entire point. It's actually the same point as law is trying to the same trick as law is trying to pull. That you take a social conflict and you pack it in such a way that you can handle it in terms of norms, regulations, and, well, laws. But take the grand example, Ukraine. I mean, you have President Trump preferring to deal direct with his friend Vlad, as he calls him, rolling out the red carpet, quite literally, granting Putin maybe his greatest interest of all, which is to be acknowledged on a par with the US as a great power, without getting anything back. But the point here is that what's going on when the US and Russia sit together and talk about how to sort of find a deal in Ukraine? Well, that's great power concert. Two great powers above the heads, not only of Ukraine, but of Europe as such. Europe is relegated to footing the bill. Right? This is great power concert. And the bad news is, of course, that this is the historical rule. This is how it was before this story I tried to tell about the coming of international organizations. So the great power concept never disappeared. I mean, the Security Council in the UN is a small great power concert. So that's all right. It becomes more important, which I think is unfortunate. I would do that as someone from a small power, wouldn't I? Well, if you look at another organizations like the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, you find that the entire conversation there has reverted to the question of confidence-building measures. They've gone back to the very basic stuff. For those of us who've been following these things for a while, there's something very familiar about this, because this is the stuff that the OSCE's predecessor, the CSCE, did in the 1970s. Confidence-building measures in 3 baskets. I mean, sometimes it's nice to have your history sort of straightened out for you. I mean, we are again reverting to a previous incarnation of cooperation. If we look to the World Trade Organizations, we find the same thing. The US and China are at one in trying to stop a lot of the work going on in that organization. For example, there is a concerted refusal, again concerted refusal to man. Do we still say to man something? Can we woman a workforce? Is that possible? Yeah, I think we say man, right? To man the internal organs for sort of looking after different conflicts. They simply what? Yes, that's right. This is done on purpose because one wants to try and take the mickey here, which is not particularly building of international organizations. So what can we do about all this? And we are here like-minded countries. Europeans, Canadians, Australians, Japanese, South Koreans, certain Latin American states, certain African states. Well, I think what we can do is to stand up for international cooperation in the shape that it has evolved in terms of international organizations and transnational networks over the last 200 years or so, which means a denser network in order to handle things on a quotidian basis. So is international cooperation still possible? Well, of course it is. We may have a setback. We may be back to where we were 50 years ago. But if you look 500 years ago, 5,000 years ago, 50,000 years ago, I think we still have reason and cause to celebrate what the species has been able to do in this sense. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Iver. I'll now call on our panelists to sit up here, and I'll be sitting here and trying to lead the conversation. So we have a two-pronged answer to the question, is cooperation possible? The first answer is that, well, the question is wrongly put. We should rather start from the basic assessment that cooperation is endemic. We just have to look in the right places. If we're not seeing cooperation, we're looking in the wrong places. The second answer is, of course, the one that Iver ended up with, which is more guarded, if you like. Yes, cooperation will go on, there will be cooperation, but it will take different forms and will be different than what we have been used to over the last 30, 40, 50, 70 years. So immediate comments from the panelists before we move on? Katharina?
Well, I think it's hard to disagree with you on that, since this is a big question, and of course there's also there's a lot of different ways to answer that. But I think I would absolutely concur that yes, the question is not only is international cooperation possible, but of course it is possible. We just need to look somewhere else. And what I particularly liked about your approach is to say, I think sometimes we start looking in the wrong place because, of course, we have so many conflicts right now that we're putting all our focus on, but we sometimes forget about the things that are actually working well. And I think you mentioned 40,000, was it, international organizations that we have out there that are regulating and governing our daily lives. So many things that are running smoothly are due to the possibility of cooperation and governing things. And I think this is something that we very often forget when we talk about the conflicts that we see that day. And that is not to say that we're not, do not have a fragile international system. We do have that, and that's absolutely at a point where we also need to discuss what is changing. But I'm also probably more on the hopeful side, as you are, because many things are running smoothly. The way that we're able to communicate every day due to the International Communication Agency regulating our satellite data, the way that we're receiving packages every day because international trade organizations have been setting up standards for that. So things are working, but of course this is not to say that we are in a situation where we need to see how can we potentially suggest other ways of cooperating in areas where it's not working.
Yeah, thank you. Great talk, very inspiring. And I also tend to agree because, as you say, humans are a cooperating species. We tend to forget that when we study international relations, because especially today, because the focus is so much on conflicts and states' interests and looking at geopolitics and the great powers, but we actually have a lot of cooperation even today, even in the least likely cases of cooperation, so to speak. For example, the global commons, right, which are the areas that are closest to anarchy in the world. They are the areas of the world that go beyond territorial control of any one state, so the high seas, space, the atmosphere, the poles. And even here we see cooperation today. For example, Mai'a mentioned the High Seas Treaty. Or we see cooperation in space, for example. But of course, the challenge is that it has become, as Iver so eloquently laid out, the multilateral order that we have as, like Norway, a small state, has based basically all its foreign policies on now for decades. That we, as a small state, we need a system that kind of balances power and where we can meet other states to solve common challenges. That is under pressure now, even if it functions, of course, in many, many aspects, and international organizations, I agree, is key. Just having random cooperation and random networks, so to speak, they wouldn't, to gain stability, you also need some kind of institutional structure. But it's more difficult, and like you also said, Iver, that most states follow the law. The problem is, of course, when the biggest ones don't. So in that sense, it has become more difficult, and we have to look into other ways, which is also why we in this project, for example, studies that how can transnational networks working with international corporations and organizations, but also in our space project, looking at why do they cooperate in certain areas and not in others, for example, to try to tease this out. But I'm optimistic, but I think it's also important to, of course, acknowledge that it has become more important when we have the creator of the multilateral order, withdrawing from all the legs, like Iver said.
Let's build on that and let me be devil's advocate for a second. I mean, if everyone agrees up here, this will be boring. If we argue that the current ecology of international organizations developed over the last 200 years or so, as I've laid it out, has been built on the bedrock of Anglo-American hegemony, right? We have had freedom of the seas more or less working for at least 170 years, since the Treaty of Paris, 1856. We don't know what a world without free trade on the oceans looks like. No one alive has ever seen that. Even your grandparents and your grandparents' parents wouldn't know what that looks like. We have no idea what will happen if this falls apart. So this is a segue into the question of, building on what Marianne said, and this goes to all the panelists, what if the pullback of the United States is not a blip, but a more permanent feature? How will the ecosystem that the US has been central to setting up continue? Will we see international organization death? Will things fall apart, to go to another early 20th century way of putting it?
Things fall apart, the center cannot hold.
Mere anarchy loosened upon the world.
Yep. I don't think this is a Yeatsian sort of. I mean, Yeats had this idea. He had a historiosophy that every 1,000 years there would be a breakdown and a new coming of civilization. This way of thinking about world history is definitely not scientific. Yeats was a great poet. He's not necessarily a great political analyst. What we see about hegemonic orders and their fall is that the order that they have left behind them usually has a long afterglow. My favorite example would be Byzantium, where Byzantium was not totally sapped of strength, but it was pretty damn sort of weak already in the 1100s, 1200s, and yet the order that it has sustained around itself was maintained until 1453, simply because other polities sort of followed the sort of logic of habit, right? And I think that's one possible reason why these things will continue. Then we have the entire literature, again, illustrious literature, on goods substitution, where one of the key points is that China is not necessarily out for the international system's goat. It's out for getting a more central place in the system, which is something very different. They want to keep the system, and they want to substitute one central agent for another or maybe two others, right? So I think the question is super apposite, particularly in terms of IR theory, but I don't think it is a killer.
So this happens when you play devil advocate and give softball pitches, right? But the others want to chip in?
I also don't think that this is going to change the international system or going to abolish the international system in terms of its multilateral system as such. The international organizations, as you were also pointing out, are based on a rule-based order, which is very much dominated, US-led, but also dominated by Western liberal values over a long time. And some of these dissonances and conflicts that we're seeing these days are also due to the challenges that are coming up, the possibility or the request also to change towards a system which is seen to be more equal, to be more fair to those countries that have not been included or feel they're not being included in this kind of value system. So you've been mentioning China. China has not been retreating from the international system, as you were also saying, or from the international organizations, but rather been trying to be reforming it from the inside, trying to advocate also for the rather the global south as such, trying to see in which way the norms can be changed. So I think the retreat would not mean a complete abolishment of the system, but what we're seeing is norms, the UN system, of course, that are based on certain values, and a reinterpretation of these norms. So it's not an abolishment of the UN Charter as such. I think China would also very much agree on this as the normative foundation of the international system. But it's about how can these norms be reinterpreted in a way that they will lead to what other states would perceive as a rather more equal and fair system that would give access to not just those dominant states from the Cold War period, but also states that have been rising or feel that they've not been heard in the system yet. So I think there is a possibility here. And at the same time, maybe to say, we've seen those treaties where the US has retreated, such as the Convention on Biological Diversity and the Paris Agreement. I mean, these treaties, while they do have their complications, of course, but they have not died. There are still negotiations going on. States are coming together. We've also seen the first time the US retreated from the Paris Agreement that while the US was gone, the states within the United States said, we'll keep on going. We'll continue our negotiations in this context. So it's there are other states, there are other actors that are also important here that have been keeping these discussions and cooperation ongoing.
Yes. I also agree that it's hard to, well, if we take the long-term perspective, the historical perspective, I guess anything can happen. I mean, how old is the nation-state idea itself, right? So it depends on on where we start. First, I don't think that the United States is a blip. I don't know. I think it will be coming back and forth maybe, but there are big changes domestically also in the United States. That means that in the foreseeable future, it's going to be a different foreign policy than we saw in the 90s and early 2000s. But what we know from our studies, for example, is that organizations, they seldom die, like you also said. So once you create organizations, they are rather stable. They are also used even today. I mean, we see even like, for example, Russia, still keeps going to the Security Council. The United States, since we have been using this marine biodiversity or high seas treaty, which is the same. As an example, the United States in 2023 also signed the treaty, even if it might not ratify, because it's seldom actually ratifies even the laws international law wants to uphold, like the law on the seas. So, and China. So there is a lot of cooperation going on also in these, like Iver said, in this small. It probably, and the other thing we also know is that, which also Iver talked about, is the extremely strong interdependencies of the world today. So, and those are really, really hard to break. I mean, it doesn't change overnight to change this kind of system. So we are so interdependent now that thinking of a world where we kind of regroup into state entities that don't cooperate, it seems to be very far-fetched, at least in the long term and or short term. And there are actors who push for more international cooperation. That is also the EU. But what we might see, of course, is much more regional cooperation. We see that in Europe, which is maybe the best case of international cooperation out there, since it's more or less quasi-federation. But also, for example, the EU cooperating with other regions, and we see also regional cooperation in other areas of the world. So we might be seeing more regionalization of the world, hopefully linked also to a multilateral order, but I think that's one of the right directions it is moving.
Mm-hmm. Unfailing optimism on the panel. We promised
Could I be pessimistic for a second?
Of course. I was trying to angle for that.
Yeah, because if we want scenarios where things go to hell in a handbasket, people are always coming up with great power war, which is, of course, always a possibility. Wars happen because there's nothing there to stop them, as the man said. But a scenario I'm taking an increasing interest in, and I'm not a sinologist, so I can't gauge the possibility of this actually coming true, but that is, what if China reverses its 1978 policy of going for state capitalism? I mean, we know that a system where all parties have fairly, well, if not similar, then at least compatible versions of capitalism is a more stable system than one where that's not the case. And the ideological competition for hegemony in world politics, we tried that during the Cold War. It was not particularly stable. What if we now reach a level of big data where China decides to say, okay, we can now do the math on so many variables that we can go back to a planned economy with an enormous artificial intelligence behind us. And we are actually coming to a point where this begins. If you look at the weather is a chaotic system. One of the founders of methodology was a Norwegian, Bjerknes, and he said that you could never have exact knowledge about the weather because there were too many variables and the system was chaotic. Well, the system is still chaotic, but we now have so many variables that we can track, that we can say quite a lot about the weather, right? And what if China does that to the economy? That will be a planned economy of a very new type, and it would make for two different principles of running the economies in the world, and that would be something. So if you want to do a what-if analysis, this is just a suggestion. I suggested it first. Well, I didn't, but I suggested it first here.
So
If you want pessimism, another what-if scenario is, of course, in Europe, if Russia wins in Ukraine. I mean, then it's also could be a very different type of world, and Europe being a different type of actor when it comes to upholding international cooperation. At the moment, as today, we are like doing this huge exercise on how to fight nuclear war. I mean, we don't even discuss that much in the media, for example. But that is actually something that Norway is involved in right now, practicing how could we contribute to nuclear war on the European continent if it comes to that, right? So there are a lot of scary what-ifs if we really want to go down that. So I think it's also, we're discussing this at so many different levels, right? So we can cooperate on some treaties, and it's possible even today, but at the same time we have, of course, this huge geopolitically uncertain background that we have to take into consideration. Was that pessimistic enough?
So we promised also that the crowd would be allowed to give their optimistic or pessimistic questions. So I will now, please stand up when you're asking your question so we can hear you up here. And introduce yourself, please.
My name is Vincent Moore. I'm the vice chair of the Republican Party here. I've heard our president spoken in many different ways here. The question I have is, I'd like to quote some Einstein. Energy is never destroyed. It just changes shape. Is not the problem, or the question you're asking here is it possible for international cooperation? Of course it is, but it will change shape. And the problem you're having is who will have influence over that changing of shape. So my question to you would be, when you're already convinced that things will change, I don't really hear how you would be able to adjust yourself to that change. So how would you, as you sit there today, how would you change yourself to accommodate change? Thank you.
Yes, I didn't touch on that at all because I stayed on the systemic level. If the question is how should units of the system actually react to these changes, and if the question is about how should Norway react to these changes, the answer would be that all three legs of the liberal world order were super conducive to Norwegian national interests. To make the world safe for democracy, great idea if you're a democracy yourself. To have free trade, super when you have a small open economy. To have international organizations, that is the dream of any small state. You get a place at the table, you have transparent, fairly transparent decision making, you have predictability, and you don't have the expectation that conflicts will be actually settled by the use of force. So I think there's a parallel to be drawn between women's role in civilization and small states' role in the international system. That anything that diminishes the importance of violence would be in the interest of women on a social level, simply because of disparities in physical strength, and anything that would make for a better organized world would be in the interest of small states. And we know what can happen if this isn't the case. Poland in the late 1700s, I think, is the most sort of speaking example, where through three partitions, three great powers simply decided to grab a bite each, right? So how should we stand up to these changes? Well, that's very simple. We should rally around the remnants of the order that we have and work with our European friends in order to stand up for the remnants of liberal world order against what is now happening in the United States.
Excuse me. It doesn't sound like it's addressing the question. The question would be...
Maybe you should ask it again.
Maybe I should ask it again. So how would you address yourself to the changes when it appears there's going to be change? how are you served by saying the same thing? I don't understand that, how that's addressing the question.
All right. Well, when there's change, it's always a possibility to stand up against that change. One doesn't have to embrace it. So what I'm suggesting is that that should be point number one. But if you ask specifically on the policy question, for example, we could take the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund. Half of it is invested in the US. Is that in Norway's interest? No, it's not. It's in our interest to get that money out before Trump starts his financial repression, which he probably will do. Roosevelt did it after the Second World War. Why shouldn't he? The 10-year-old bonds could be sort of prolonged to 15 years, for example, or the interest rate could be changed. Is it in Norway's interest and other countries' interest to invest in the US in such a situation? No, it's not. So we should try and get that money out as soon as possible. Now, the problem with that, I'm not finished, but the problem with that is that if we do it, then the security guarantee that we depend on may be jeopardized. So we have a huge trade-off problem.
We have to take others as well. Thank you, sir. I saw someone over here, but... No, but I can allow the... Oh, thank you.
Thank you. I'm Elin Østebø Hansen, a former ambassador, Norwegian ambassador to the WTO and the OECD. So I'm obviously particularly interested in the economic side of this. But my question is related to yes, thank you for the optimism. International organization cooperation is possible, but how in this situation? And the multilateral cooperation that we have been taking for granted and been enjoying for quite some time was created after World War II. And actually, in my view, I think one of the problems is not enter Trump only. It's that we haven't been able to update the system since then. And well, a lot of years has gone by. In the WTO, we did something because we created the WTO on the basis of the GATT, but the change of the powers, the economic powers in the world, has not been taken into account. We haven't been able to finalize the Doha round. So before it was the US, when the US and the EU agreed, we had a deal. Now it's not the case anymore. So same thing with the UN. We have the UN reformed for 40 years or more, and nothing happened. Representation in the Security Council. So if one thing is to fight against the changes, but how do you see how should we start reforming the system in order to make it work for the present situation? Thank you.
Want me to start? Since it's such an easy question to answer. Yeah, well, as you said, the WTO was struggling long before Trump, right? Because the arbitrary court, it hasn't been working, so it's been difficult to solve. But at the same time, the EU and the United States have had their trade disagreements. At least they've had discussions within the WTO, right? So the big change now is that the United States also don't support these organizations, like Iver said, even if they also want to cooperate on certain things. I agree that and this whole kind of reform of the UN has also been on the agenda for so long. And it's of course more difficult to reform something when there's underlying conflict. So at the moment, I study the European Union. This is my main study area, and also then transatlantic relations and international cooperation, but also often from the lens of the European Union. And we see that at least the EU is doing quite a bit to try to respond to these challenges. So in Europe, we're seeing a lot of more cooperation, and at least trying to respect the rules. For example, now that Norway has these discussions with the EU on the customs war, the trade war, they have asked the WTO to consider whether or not Norway can be included into the EU's tariff system. So it's kind of trying to uphold. But I think what is going on, and I think you're right, is that there's so much more now going on outside the WTO. We're looking from the EU again. The EU's one of the EU's approaches now is to engage in trade negotiations and get agreements with as many countries as possible in the world to kind of respond to what's going on in with the United States. So that is like the very clear strategy, and they also kind of use the argument that come to us because we follow the rules. So you will get something that you can trust. But when they say come to us, we follow the rules, they refer to the WTO regulations and rules, right? So at least the norm system is upheld, but how you can reform a system without that was built by the United States, without the United States.
Exactly.
That is the big question, right? So would you then imagine but you could have a multilateral system that continues, that works within the WTO, but you just sideline the United States. I don't think it's possible, but it's either that or we will continue seeing more regional cooperation and more ad hoc coalitions, which is where we are moving at the moment, even if many of the norms are upheld by key actors like the EU. So I know I don't answer your question, but it's I guess that's what a lot of international diplomats are struggling to do. But at the moment we see things going on outside the WTO, but with the WTO norms of the back of people's heads, so to speak.
The questions are coming. Now they're coming. So I 1, 2, 3, 4. Let's take 2 and 2.
Gerrit Tolland, political advisor for the Eastern Barents Sea Initiative.
Could you speak up, please?
Yeah, Gerrit Tolland, the political advisor for the Eastern Barents Sea Initiative. Iver, you talked about that despite the demise of hegemons, the norms and systems that they've set up, they still prevail. You discussed the Byzantine Empire. I have a bit of a twofold question. First of all, I have the impression that the world is moving faster, and that these kind of systems that are set up, they will also demise or disappear faster. So that's first. Secondly, you also said the point that the system might still be there, but the way the system works is going to change. So, for example, China might reinterpret norms, how preemptive self-defense, these kind of things, and that seems paradoxical to me because, for example, taking preemptive self-defense, isn't that already going against the system that we've set up? So it's not really the system that we are used to. Thank you.
One more.
Sure. Thank you. That was a really great talk, Iver, and I really appreciated the historical background as well. And it made me think about kind of the frontier of science and technology today and whether there is historical analogy that we can learn from. So I'm particularly thinking of biotech, quantum computing, semiconductors, which we're seeing really getting kind of more nationalized and politicized. But one of the great things about the liberal international order has been this norm of open science and free sharing of knowledge. It's embedded in the EU's very founding documents, and it's also showcased in the International Geophysical Year in the middle of the 20th century, even despite so much tension on Earth. But now we're seeing more of this kind of hardening again at the frontier of science and tech. Just wondering if you might have any lessons from this bigger picture perspective that would help us see pathways forward to avoid kind of nationalizing of all this knowledge.
So both of those questions primarily for you, Iver.
Well, let me start with the latter one. It's super interesting to me that the history of open science is so short. I mean, we're talking it begins with what some people call the subtle sites, the settle time into modernity from 1750 to 1850. Very little along those lines before that. The French philosophers were initiating this, and the opponent was always religion. And when I look at the onslaught on learning today, the attacks on Columbia, Harvard, and the list goes on, I see religion in the background there. And I think it was a mistake well, let me rephrase that. The Enlightenment's relationship to religion was unnecessarily sharp, I think, because they talked about it as if you would either have knowledge coming out of religion or knowledge coming out of science. And I think this way of thinking is now making a return in evangelical circles in the US. And I think there's a category mistake at the bottom of that, because religion does not, in certain incarnations, religion will try to sort of lay down the law for how to order society, of course. But the primary thrust of religion is to answer questions that are outside the purview of science. So the trick here would be to try and talk to religious people about science and open science in ways where one is trying to demarcate where the authority of one starts and the other begins. And this is, of course, a Protestant talking, because Luther was very big on the two regimental way of thinking about the world, that you should give unto Caesar what is Caesar's and unto God what is God's. So there is already the foundations for this way of thinking. But I think it's a very good idea on a general level, and I think that is one way of trying to talk to people who want to attack the norms of open science in order to do it. And I share the desperation I spot at the bottom of that question, talking about meteorology again. How can we predict global weather if we don't have data from global sources and if we don't have any places to archive it? And in the US, they are now trying to sort of destroy series of data on previous weather, which we need in order to predict coming weather. So yes. Notice two questions are very general. Will IOs disappear with the hegemon? That may, of course, happen. But it's a key principle in the social sciences that the causes that are behind the formulation of a phenomenon or the emergence of a phenomenon are not necessarily the same causes that perpetuate that phenomenon. You get married for certain reasons when the all the big stuff wears off fairly quickly. May continue for very different reasons, or at least somewhat different reasons. And this is a general thing in society, that a phenomenon may begin for one reason and then it may be perpetuated for others. So I think there are a number of good reasons why international organizations will survive, specific international organizations. And then you talk about changes inside the system and, for example, preemptive self-defense. Well, one of the things I tried to get across in my talk was that the idea that you can somehow tame stuff like preemptive self-defense was never 100%. We talked about making the world, the US particularly talked about making the world safe for democracy, but that was never bought by a number of the other players, including some very big players, right? So there is never such a thing as an uncontested world order. There will always be a struggle between different ideas of how to do this. So what we look for is the balance between those forces, right? And you're absolutely right that there are thrusts against all this stuff, and that preemptive self-defense is, of course, a challenge for a liberal world order. But then again, preemptive self-defense was always there, and it was always practiced. You know, even at the height of the liberal world order, we can see examples of that, right? So the idea that you need an order that is totally homogeneous without any opposition is, I think, impossible. Again, with reference to the species. That's not how we operate. We change. Right?
So we have two more questions, and please be relatively brief, and because I wanted to give them 1 more minute to respond.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Alex Cooley, fellow IR researcher. Thanks for the shout out there, Iver. So one of the ways which, and thank you for the discussion, I think you're capturing a good deal of this contestation between certain social networks on the one hand, desire for cooperation, and then this reassertion of state sovereignty and great concert system. But could you speak to the growth of transnational networks on the other side of the issues that you talk about, right? Because I think it's very convenient to blame Trump and the US as the principal sort of barrier, but the carbon lobby predates Trump, right? They had a whole concerted effort to take down green financing that included state attorney generals, corporations, that was actually quite successful. Of course, Trump was the death knell. Peter Thiel calling financial regulation the Antichrist. And then, of course, big tech. I'd like to get your thoughts on that. So in your particular issue areas, how do these counter-transnational movements, right, complicate this story about states versus, transnational movements that, we think are conducive to cooperation?
Thank you, Alex.
More comment, maybe a provocation than a question, but the thinking of Trump as anti-cooperation. I think of Trump as pro-cooperation, and he's pro-cooperation with autocracies, and the Argentina situation today, I think, is very telling. $40 billion he's paying to affect the outcome of the election in Argentina. Mm-hmm. What if he does that in Norway? What are you going to do about it? He's clearly trying to immobilize the European Union through the relationship with Hungary, maybe Slovakia as well. This is not an uncooperative attitude. This is cooperation with autocracy. And that's what I think you face for the next couple of years.
You want to go first?
No, thanks for the questions. I think that's important point. Probably also bringing it back to the overall questions of the project itself. I think you're very right that there is often an overemphasis, maybe we're trying to be more positive about the effect of these transnational networks if we only think about them in terms of civil society creating alliances around issue areas which are really pressing not just the local context but which are also transnationally transmitted, of course. And you're very right. There's, of course, also the dark side of that, if you want so, those kind of coalitions that are going against what could be in the public interest. So I think one key question here again is the notion of legitimacy. So if we think about international cooperation, what kind of interests are represented and in which way does this coalition but also institution actually represent in an authoritative way legitimate interests of groups. And I think there's probably an issue with those international institutions while they've been opening up for non-state actors, and that's been like a key thing of also bringing marginalized groups in. At the same time, it's been flowing in a lot of other actors that have quite different kind of perspectives and interests, of course, that are there. I don't have an answer to that in that sense. I think, again, it's weighing out different ways. If we think about climate cooperation, of course, there's a lot of groups that are these counter-transnational movements, as you're saying, the oil lobby, of course, very dominantly there. At the same time, you would also have a lot of groups that are networks and even business actors that are also signing on voluntary agreements and to reduce their own emissions. So again, it's not such a clear-cut picture of like who are the bad guys, who are the good guys. We need to look a bit more at the nuances of cooperation again.
Okay, thanks. Two really good questions. I think that to the first question, maybe the biggest challenge, we're talking about international cooperation now, but of course the biggest challenge we're facing is the undermining of democracy from within. And you have these transnational networks that also cut, for example, transatlantic networks, which is, I guess, what you also referred to, that try to do that. When there are like, actually, there is this, of course, the transatlantic right-wing network that is there, but it's also surprisingly active. There are studies on how, for example, right-wing movements in the United States are funding court cases in Europe, for example, on taking cases to court to challenge LGBTQ plus rights, for example, the right to abortion. So they're funded by very rich people in the United States. So this is absolutely a huge problem, and it goes together. And you also mentioned big tech. I mean, AI, disinformation is also another kind of core challenge to democracies. How can we deal with that? It's difficult. There are so many different layers, but just to one thing that also Iver talked about is, of course, regulation. In Europe, there is a right-wing movement, but it hasn't become as big as to threaten European Union at the moment. And I'm not sure if it will, but it's something that has to be. There's a reason why people also protest, of course. So it's huge. It's a big question. But it's when it comes to, for example, at least the big tech regulation has to be, in my view, the solution. And in Europe, in that sense, Europe is one of the tools that the European Union is using is the Brussels effect. So you can say a lot of things about the legitimacy of the European Union when it comes to migration policies and all that, but leaving that aside, regulating big tech by regulating big tech on the European that operate in the European market will regulate them also more generally. They're doing the same in space with the Space Act. If you regulate operators on the European soil, you indirectly regulate Elon Musk as well, right? So this is at least for that part of it. It's one of the oldest modern societies. It's one of our key tools, after all, to regulate. So I see some hope in that, and I also see that the EU is a leader in this area, which is good. And then, actually, in the trade negotiations with Trump, the EU stood. They never. They have been true to their regulatory aims, right? They haven't caved on that at all. So that's at least a good sign. Norway's biggest challenge is, of course, that we are so dependent on the United States. So we're always balancing this. How can we can't really defend ourselves yet, so we have to balance how we relate to the United States. But you are right. I mean, I think we're just still trying to get our heads around the fact that we have a United States that is no longer supporting us, and that's even threatening to occupy parts of an allied country's territory in Greenland. It's just super difficult. But I think that this is what we have to do is to look to Europe, like Iver said. There's really no alternative, and Europe is trying to do a lot in this domain, but it takes time. But we could face a situation, of course, where Norway is also threatened. Just look at how scared we were before the Nobel Peace Prize announcement. We were scared of what the United States might do. It says everything about transatlantic relations now, right? So we have to take this into consideration. We have to realize that we can't really, we won't get loyalty back from the United States, so to speak. So, yeah.
So we have a minute and a half left, and I think it's fitting. We've been tempering down the early optimism with there's some cold in the veins now. But still, I sense an underlying optimism here still. But Iver, I'll return to you for the last words.
Thank you. I will use that to answer the questions as well. Humans are a cooperating species, and that obviously includes the hard right as well. You're absolutely right to point out that there is cooperation, and always was cooperation between nationalists. Mazzini was the big man on this, the Italian ideologue in the 1800s, where he was very much in favor of organizations like Young Italy, Young Sweden, Young France, etc. But there was also a Young Europe, where all these organizations were supposed to cooperate. And in the interwar period, particularly the French hard right was very keen on setting up international fascist cooperation, and quite successfully so. So cooperation is a human trait. It goes for all humans, irrespective of what kind of political sort of bent they have. What I was talking about was liberal cooperation, where one takes as a point of departure that society consists of different spheres that have relative autonomy. And I think that's where the advanced Trump way of cooperating does not necessarily work. But this all sort of top-down, politics should trump everything. And we know this figure from states like China and Russia as well, that there should be no cooperations that would not be linked directly to the state and be under state control. And that's a different kind of cooperation. What would we do if there were a campaign where cooperation was made between the hard right in Norway and the hard right in the US in order to boycott the election? Well, we would learn from Moldova and Romania and use the same, I think, practices that they've done. Alex's question about international cooperation and the protests against that predating Trump quite obviously. I mean, Trump is the efficient cause of the crisis here, but not the underlying one. That's why I started with Henry Kissinger's good advice to Nixon that was not heeded. If memory serves, there are 193 member states in the UN, and there is only one that hasn't ratified the Children's Rights Convention, and that's the US. Somalia ratified a couple of years ago. I mean, this tells us something. Right?
It tells us something. It also tells us that the time is up. So thanks for coming. Thanks for coming to this joint fire. We're not sitting like the Neanderthals with our different campfires. We're all joined in one room talking about the same topics with some optimism, but a little pessimism as well. So go out, enjoy the rest of your day, and thanks for coming.